Welcome, everyone. Today we'll be learning about the story behind the books. I am Christine Noelle. I'm a writer and a marketing consultant. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I am honored to be hosting and moderating this panel today. First up, we have Sophia Kouidou-Giles. Sophia was born in Greece, and she resides in the US. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and Master's in Social Work. She has been published in Voices, Persimmons Tree, The Raven's Perch, The Blue Nib, and in an anthology entitled The Time Collection. It's a poetry chapter book. And her poetry chapter book is Transitions and Passages. She has two memoirs, one in Greek language and one you'll be hearing about today, Sophia's Return. And next up we have Joanna. She is the author of This Way Back. She has published essays and poems in Arts and Letters, Essay, Bellingham Review, Sweeter Voices Still, and LGBTQ Anthology from Middle America. After growing up in New York and Cyprus, she earned a PhD from the University of Missouri. Today, she lives in Virginia and teaches at Christopher Newport University and the writing workshops in Greece. So they both have two beautiful books, and we're so very excited to hear about them today. Okay, so I read for many reasons, and I know we all do. And what I really enjoy is being able to be entertained, being able to be inside someone else's head. You know, I always love the idea that the words we read are actually someone else's thoughts at some point in time. And I really like to read to be transported to another time and place. And so today you'll be able to see that all of these things, being emotionally connected, learning, and being transported. And so let's go for a ride. So first up, we have Sophia. Sophia, would you like to begin this session?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for sharing your time with us from wherever you are. And I'm going to have to say kalimera, kalispera, good morning, good night, wherever you are. You're very welcome here. Our theme is going to be Greece. We both connect to the language and the country, and we have stories that are based on our experiences there and here a little bit. You know, it's the dual lens of life, bicultural stuff. My particular story is about childhood days that left me with a big question. My story is about being a child of divorce that did not know much about what was going on in the household. I was very young, 7, when my parents separated and divorced. So here I come to this country, career, family, child, work, the whole 9 yards. And I'm at the point of retirement, and I still don't know the answers that I want. So that's what drove the whole excursion back to Greece, back to the past, to figure out my own family story. And it started with some genealogy research. Where did my parents come from? What was their background? How did they get together? And that is going to be the first segment I'm reading from. It sets the time and the place. So my parents found each other in the typical fashion of the day. Theirs was an arranged marriage. It was the way most young people were wedded in mid-20th century Greece. And they were, like so many young couples, introduced by a matchmaking business acquaintance. At the time, World War II was ending and people's hopes for a peaceful life were revived. As the German occupation of Thessaloniki was winding down, My parents were married in 1943 at the Greek Orthodox Church of Grigorios Palamas, filled with hopes and a new dawn approaching. 3 years later, I was born during another challenging time. Between 1946 and 1949, the Greek resistance that during World War II countered the Italian and German occupiers had become politicized and had broken out in civil war. The Democratic Army of Greece, supported by England and the US, fought against the Greek communists who were backed by the Soviet Union and our Balkan neighbors, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria. In our safe neighborhood universe, though, all that was unfolding did not touch our daily routines. Carrying me in her arms, my mother visited Mrs. Katina, a heavyset, wide-hipped woman with long black hair. Daily, our neighbors, she lived 2 houses over from us, and she was my wet nurse. She had delivered her daughter, Sula, about the same time as I was born. My mother would take me to Mrs. Katina's ample breasts, and the 2 women would chat while I was feeding, perhaps because my mother's milk had not come in, or maybe because it was fashionable. Not that it really matters. They enjoyed these conversations, and later on, Sula and I became friends. Everyone called us sisters of the same milk. During all those years that my family lived on the 25th of March Street, my childhood home, the 2 of us spent endless hours in play. It was a friendly neighborhood where my father's 2 sisters, Aunt Eleni and Iulia's family lived. People met in their backyards and kept their front doors unlocked. Women carried on quick conversations during the day across fences and occasionally took breaks to share a cup of Turkish coffee and a cold glass of water with my paternal grandmother, Yaya Sophia, and my mother. Carefree days, play, just sun and fun. And here we come to the day where I turned 7 years old. And we are still careless, playing in the Alana, the big dirt square outside our house, playing hide and go seek, hopscotch, and all that. It was a day like that, and that is going to be the next segment I'm reading. Sorry? Okay. So here we are, playing hide and go seek, and I'm running out of breath. I want to stop. I'm out, I shouted, crossing the expanse of the Alana to get a glass of water when I noticed a truck parked in front of our house. But it wasn't our jalopy, my father's business truck. I stopped and squinted to be sure, but nope, the truck wasn't like anything I knew. Stranger still, our front door was wide open and men were moving a trunk and boxes out to the parked vehicle. The cab was nearly full and I thought I saw Mother's nightstand loaded in. The men were mostly habals, porters, but not anyone I knew from Father's warehouse in the Ladadka district. They were moving quickly, hardly speaking to each other. Who had let them in? And where was my father? A man came out then, sat behind the wheel and started the engine, waiting for the engine to warm up. Just as quickly, my mother walked out of the house. her gait unsteady, and took the passenger seat. I tried to get her attention, but she was looking away from me, so far off in the distance that I couldn't imagine exactly what she was thinking. Then, with a snap, she pulled the door shut. If she cried, I couldn't see it, though I imagine now, all these years later, that same image of my mother hunched forward, contemplating her life, forlorn as a loon. And then, just as soon as I'd noticed them, they were gone. A couple of Hamals slammed the cab doors and climbed on the back, riding the truck bumper a la Scalomaria, likely getting a lift to the next bus stop. Slowly, the truck disappeared on an elbow turn of the road, but still no one came out of the house. Nothing moved as the truck rolled away with my mother in the cab. I watched it, motionless, a chill coursing through my body and a vague sense of fear seizing my heart. And that's what started the whole search, that memory, that question of what the hey is going on in this household. It was not an easy time because I found people reluctant to share what they knew, if they knew anything. So you will have to read the book now to find out how I went about and how I drew out more of that picture as close as I could. And with this, I pass the baton to Joanna.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was beautiful and also really intriguing. We all want to know what happened. How did you manage to understand the things that went unspoken? And that's kind of what I read for, to understand what it feels like to be inside another person's kind of mind and heart. Sophia and I have kind of opposite stories in that she grew up in Greece and became an immigrant to the United States. I was born in New York, and as I'll read, my father, who was an immigrant from Cyprus, felt a very strong nostalgia and decided when I was 10 years old that we had to go back so that the children would know who they are. And I'll read a little bit from my book, which is called This Way Back, but I leave it sort of ambiguous. Is this way back the way back my father's way back to his homeland, or is it me coming back to my Greek roots, to my American sort of birthplace, or is it about going back to sort of the person we once were before maybe traumas happened and things like that? So I'm going to read from an essay called Ithacas, and it has an epigraph from Cavafy, which is, wise as you've become and full of experience, you will have understood what Ithacas mean. I was born with nostalgia in my blood. Immigrants from all parts of the world tell stories of their old country's perfection, but diaspora Greeks hold on to their homeland with a special tenacity. You can't live very long in Greece without hearing songs of the bitter bread and hard, cold beds of xenitia, those psomitis xenitia sinepikro, which means exile or far from Greece. When I had learned enough Greek to understand these songs, I wondered at the pleasure Greeks seemed to take in singing about exile's pain. Like the bite of retsina in their wine, like the moan of bagpipes in their music, longing for an Ithaca from the distance of Calypso's island still moves the Greeks to sing. And while Odysseia, archetype and father of all homeward wanderers, finally got home and stayed, most Greek emigres take up residence abroad, making xenitia and distance from Ithaca their fate. For Greece is poor, Its soils are barren and its industry unable to turn a profit. Greek immigrants in America chink glasses of whiskey and ouzo and remember Mother Greece, the sun-soaked land surrounded by the sparkling Aegean, Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Ionian seas. I was born in America, the world's youngest empire. My earliest memory takes place in one of its states during a visit my maternal grandfather paid to my house in Queens. I was 18 months old, and so I remember his knee at about my eye level and his shoe resting on it, in the fireplace ablaze. In my memory, my grandfather's shoe is so well shined, it reflects the flames which flicker against a black surface, orange tongues lapping at the toe. I remember the incline of his trousers shin and the brown frame of an armchair, but most of all, the orange flames against the shoe. Such flames would appear before me again, much later, in a museum screen reproduction of fire raging against the already charred ruins of Zmirni's Greek and Armenian quarters. It was a camera trick, footage of fire superimposed on the photographs of the razed neighborhoods of Zmirni. Photographs preserved since mid-September 1922, when the fire drove hundreds of thousands toward the sea. As their city became a charnel house, they waited, as Hemingway described in On the Quay at Zmirni, to become either refugees or ash. The museum itself, situated inside the iconic Thessaloniki landmark, is now called the White Tower. It was called the Red Tower until about 100 years ago, because it was a prison and the site of so many bloody executions. At the time of my earliest memory, of course, I knew nothing of executions or empires or nations or modernity or wars, nothing of ship manifests or Ellis Island or grandfathers for that matter, or fires. That I remember the flames reflected in my Papu Spiros' shoe at all is a result of the many times I recalled it, reassembled the scattered members of the moment in remembrance, and created the memory anew, a memory of embers. I'm going to skip a little bit in the essay. This is called Ithacas, and I wasn't planning on reading the part about my college years, but I have a college friend in the audience who does appear in the book. I went to college in Ithaca, not the Ionian Island, the city in upstate New York. The unending precipitation, any upstate New Yorkers can relate to this. The unending precipitation, and maybe the Pacific Northwesters will relate, and relentless cloud cover, low, gray, and ugly, hid even that dull strip of Cayuga Lake that, on clear days, served for me as a glimpse of water to soothe the absence of my Mediterranean. All the Cornell Greeks used to gather on weekends and complain, besotted with a yearning for return, at a place a little deeper than romance. The Greeks drank too much and danced together and complained about the absence of light and about this gray prison city, Ithaca, its people so cheerful and its hills so low. We complained beautifully, ending the nights at 4 a.m. with the notes of nostalgia on a guitar. The old songs, the rebetika of refugees from Asia Minor, brought together undergrads, grad students, and professors who all desired their own memory of Greece. The Greeks sang of the moonlight, of their country's fall from glory. Give the Greek an empty chair, a tumbler full of alcohol or air, and he will dance the zebekiko, the solitary dance of the Byzantine border lords. He tumbles into each next step, tripping, bending, falling, rising before he hits the floor. Around him in a circle, we clap and bend our necks, not in worship, but in love. And the dancer swings his leg circles over a stranger's neck. In the summer of 2010, I had just been admitted to a graduate program that came with a 9-month teaching appointment in America and an all expenses paid trip to Greece each summer. I would work for the study abroad program for a month, then fly cheaply to Cyprus. I'll have the best of both worlds, I told my Cypriot friends and family, a salary from America and all summer to read and write by the beach. In a way, it's still a compromise that leaves me where my father spent his life, on the edge of two worlds. In another, it's a way of at once claiming both countries and none. In one of my favorite songs, songwriter Manolis Rasoulis says that the heart is the sweetest homeland. Its land is made of pain and joy. Putaya homatatus tutis ponos quejará. The heart may be the sweetest homeland, and Greece, as Rasoulis writes, may have taught generations of immigrants to breathe and die no matter what land they find themselves on. But even as I spend winter after winter in America, the cypress of carob, terebinth, and cyclamen pulls me. I feel that I know who I am through this yearning, for the churning of seas, for the light of the sun, the slope of a rock, the lift of a wave. I love to run in the heat of an American day and watch sunlight sparkle on water that makes me ache even harder for Cyprus, where I cannot stay. While I run, sweat runs down my face as it does when I run in the sun-parched hills close to my home. I love to smell ocean. Even in America, I always find water to run beside, to smell the salt and the dying fish as I remember mountains sloping into the sea. I live the new Greek poetry and the old, old stories. I live my myth and my story as I run by the shore of an Atlantic inlet that smells to me like the wide Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.
Wow, what beautiful detail. I'm transported. Beautiful, beautiful writing. And really, you can really see it. Thank you both. We're going to move into the question and answer section of this nice panel here. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Sophia and Joanna, you both touched on this, but I'd like to ask this is, what is the main unanswered question that drove you to write the book? Sophia?
Well, I sort of addressed that in my reading, I think. It's the yearning to get to the roots, identity, where did I come from and what has influenced my life, and parents are such an important part of our identity. It was natural for me when I was done with career and running around to go back to Greece and start tracing and chasing and asking questions, which I systematically did for about 10 years after retirement. I would just pound on everybody for information. So I think that is, learning about circumstances of our birth and of our ancestors' lives is really a basic part of our makeup. I still have those stories, tell those stories, especially at my age. It's all about remembering some days. So that's pretty much what I think of that.
Awesome. And I already see some questions for us coming into the chat. We prepared some questions for each other just to get us rolling, but we're really excited to see your questions for Sophia. And I had a very similar process of wondering about my parents and wondering, why did we bounce back and forth? We went back to Cyprus and back to New York multiple times. And so part of writing was to discover why. And I want to sort of emphasize what Sophia was saying about the importance of writing. Some people imagine that writing is the purpose is to express emotions that you already, or articulate what you already know. And I think for creative writing, for us as writers, a lot of it is on the first level is expressing what we feel and articulating what we have in our head, but writing is discovery. And I think both of us, while writing out and looking for the words to express what did I feel, trying to get, for me, and I think both of us trying to get into the minds of our parents, we discovered a lot. And I always tell people that we have a doctor in the audience, I'm sure we have maybe a lawyer or a dentist, you need licenses for that. And Sophia was as a social worker, you need a license to practice, you don't need a license to write. And this is available to everyone, to just sit down with a piece of paper and write your memories. I think we've both benefited a lot from that process because we discovered what we didn't know before we started writing.
And it was the discovery, and it was also the change that it brought in my psyche. It was the calmness of now I have the picture, or as much of it as I'm going to have. So I can set that aside, if you will, and move on into my life more energetically. That's the feeling I have after completing the memoir.
In the searching for these answers, can you touch a little bit on the investigative process? You know, a lot of times when we're looking to find answers, you know, it's not as easy as asking a question sometimes. Can you both touch on how you went about investigating to find the answers you were seeking?
Well, that was kind of the fun part and the painful part, both, you know. There was a lot of times of travel, going to the locations these primary people came from and trying to find relatives that were associated with them and would know more about them. Just the process of interviewing people is a process of connecting. You know, it's also a process of permission, giving each other permission to share our own stories. It's liberating. I'm not pretending to be anything. I am who I am, and now you can be who you are. And it just opens up the floodgates of connection. Those were some of the important pieces, but I did spend a fair amount in the library, trying to understand the history, the historical context of when all of this was happening, because it did have consequences on the choices they made, my parents and my relatives. You know, they were refugees. My father was a refugee from Turkey. So he came and, like myself, like an immigrant, he had to establish and build his life. And he made decisions based on that. My mother was a local woman. You know, she had a different feeling about belonging, a different baseline for starting her life. So, Joanna, to you.
I didn't need to do quite as many interviews because there wasn't quite as much of a mystery. I did a little bit more observing, but I did have to learn quite a bit about the historical context because I wanted my American readers to understand the complexities of Cyprus. And in order for that to happen, I had to understand and figure out, for me, it was a lot of rewriting, figure out how I could divide and the complexities of the history and the politics and sort of figure out ways to relate it to things in American culture and politics so that I wouldn't lose readers which was something I struggled with in the beginning. And so for me, it was an investigation that was a little more of reading and reckoning with myself and struggling with myself. Something that we have to do as writers that is hard for young writers is also to acknowledge for me, like I write about there's a like my parents' homophobia and I come out as gay. And so that's a really big problem. And so I had to wrestle with writing it. So I don't want to just present myself as the victim, and I have to think, so there's a lot of sort of soul wrestling with, okay, understand my parents' point of view, explain to readers why my Orthodox religion is really important to me, explain to secular people who don't care about church why I care. So there's a lot of reckoning within the writing to make my story make sense to the readers.
Well, there's a lot of,
go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a lot of opportunity in dialogue to highlight that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the dialogue, another aspect of the dialogue is with the family members that are now reading this book. And, you know, everybody has a point of view about their own story. And that is what I put forth in my book. We all have different angles on the picture. So there isn't total agreement from other relatives about what I wrote. But I think in the end, there is more of an acceptance of my point of view, because that is what I'm trying to put forth in the book. There was one relative that felt a little bit offended by the way I approached the role my grandmother played in this story. And, you know, so be it. In fact, I'm writing the story about my mother, but when I think about my grandmother, I still love her and owe her a heck of a lot. So it all depends what the point of the story is.
Very good. Yes. So we have some questions coming through the chat. So Sophia, can you talk more about the process for finding out what happened? It was a real detective story.
Right. It was looking for clues. And when I got a no, I thought, okay, what's the way around? What is my way around? And so I did resort, you will see, in searching for documentation, objective documentation that would give me clues. And it was going to City Hall. That's how the book starts, you know, I'm trying to find out what they had on record for my mother. Initially, the search was, where is she buried? I did not know when she was buried, where? And then it went on to, okay, who knows about that? So then I started a search, and the search was, all right, I have this first cousin that is, you know, a person that lived and visited and knew a lot about my mother. I have to find her. And it was quite a situation, you know, where I kept dropping notes, looking up in phone books, visiting addresses, trying to find the person out, who finally got one of those notes and called me, and we met, and I learned a whole bunch of other information. So in that sense, working with an attorney was another way I went about it. So detective, yeah.
Yes, definitely. It's helpful to have those resources outside the family in addition to family resources. For both of you, Joanna, what was the greatest epiphany or secret you uncovered during the writing of your memoir?
So I also talked to an attorney, although it wasn't for the purpose of discovering something. I was figuring out my father's will, executing the will, looking for some property. This is not a surprise to the Greeks in the audience, looking for some property that was still in the name of great-grandparents. And I had a phone conversation with a lawyer that I narrate in the chapter called Inheritance Law. And the lawyer told me a story about my father's sort of his motivation, his reasons for looking for land and trying to get it. to restore it, kind of to get it into the names of people who were alive, that aligned with my father's presentation of himself. And unfortunately, I had to then admit that I was surprised. I hadn't quite believed that my father was invested in kind of collecting the family property because he had such a strong sense that this is important, that he had a duty. I thought he just kind of wanted the money or something like that. I was more suspicious of a more sort of maybe that my father was more selfish than he was letting on. But then I got his lawyer's perspective was that my father's story was what was the truth. So that's something you can discover while kind of investigating, whether it's documents, like some of us don't believe our parents, but don't believe the story our parents tell. And then finding out that they were telling the truth can be itself a discovery. And then I'll talk about an epiphany later. Sophia's turn.
I kind of think I answered it, so let's go on.
Sure. So Sophia, one question from the group is how were you changed by what you discovered with regard to your parents' divorce?
It was feeling like I had dealt with that part of my life. I had a place for it. I had an understanding of it. And I could talk about it differently, I could talk about a relationship with my mother that became difficult because of the divorce. It wasn't that daily connection one has with a parent. It was a weekend visit. And then we have the ocean between us, she's in Greece and I'm in America. So it's a little touch on a summer vacation visit. I did bring her here for a short time, but it was much later in her life. And she could not adjust. So she wound up returning and living the rest of her life in Greece. So anyway, for myself, it brought a sense of resolution and a sense of peace. And again, a sense of freedom to move on and see, all right, what's next in my life? Okay, I wrote this, now I'm gonna write something different, very different, in fact. And I can talk about that some too.
We have a question from Genia that says, I grew up in a Greek Catholic church, which for my Ukrainian refugee parents was more important culturally, and no one on our family seemed very religious. Is this how you experienced religion in your families?
In my family, it's quite a contrast to how Joanna describes her faith-based approach. My father, and I'm quoting here, used to say, light one candle to God and one candle to the devil. That's pretty radical. The man was not religious. The man was an agnostic. And I got that message from him. Later in my life, when my father remarried, I found that my stepmother was a very faithful church people, very active in the church. I was a teenager at the time. Guess what I chose? I chose my father's point of view. So.
Joanna, do you have some to share?
Yeah, because my mother is of Greek descent, but born here. I attribute in the first essay where I dramatize my father's funeral and some of the rituals to do with death and memorial services, I suggest, and I think I'm right, that my mother is more fixated on like the rule, doing things correctly according to the dogma. I attribute that to her being American because I I think that it's sort of more American. And then my father, and the Greeks and the Cypriots that I grew up with are more interested in the rituals and those traditions rather than exactly what the church says. In fact, when I've done events with predominantly Greek people, they've been like, why do you care about what the religion says? Aren't you worried about your family? They actually Greek people kind of expect more concern than what I have about my family and sexuality as opposed to the church. So yeah, my mom was and is very religious, but it's almost like in an American Orthodox way of really caring about the dogma and the rules that are written down.
Well, and in your stories, both personal and, can you speak to how it feels to open yourself up in writing these stories, and then, seeing how the stories are received? Can you share your experience in that?
Well, I found it touching because it opened communication with others. It was on a more plain, everyday, honest level. I think I have experienced a lot more sharing from people as a result, probably, of just bottling my own story in this memoir. I'm basically an introvert. I would have never sat down and given all of this out. No, it had to be the page, and that's how I got it down. And that is my way of sharing it with the world. So it's also a feeling of feeling exposed at times, especially with people that I don't know. The familiar people are a lot easier to be around and talk about this. People I don't know, I am kind of sizing up to see their reaction. And once we get past that, it's good.
I also have a kind of two sides of this. For me, the first draft is where I feel very exposed. Even though no one is reading it, I feel very vulnerable and exposed when I've first written something. But something I think that readers don't realize when they are receiving our vulnerability and learning kind of secrets that aren't typically shared kind of in public, I think what's not evident is how much control the writer has over the narrative as drafts proceed. So I feel after that first draft, which is very vulnerable, once I shape it and sort of sculpt and decide, I feel quite a bit of power in my decision of what to include, how to tell the story, and then to publish. So even though I do get these questions a lot, like how could you possibly share such intimate details, because I feel so empowered by having the tools to articulate which parts of my story I want to, that part doesn't feel as vulnerable, although I get the question a lot because sometimes the readers feel themselves kind of sort of exposed or reflected. So what my writing does is it has the power to actually cause a sense of vulnerability in the readers, and that kind of intimate connection is what literature is for. But yeah, it's not the scary part isn't the distribution of the book, it's the initial writing, which causes some discomfort and surprises. I teach creative writing, and so I remind students, like, your subconscious holds on to things and doesn't want to admit certain things. And when you get into the writing mode, your subconscious will sort of let things out, and you can shock yourself. So that's the hard part.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's so much learning and growing that happens in this organic process. We're here together, and it's just so wonderful. And if we could be together in person, that'd be even better. But if there was one message that you hope to pass on to your readers, what would that be?
Well, for me, is if you have a question that bugs you, a question about your life, a question that remains vague, but it is important to you, don't give up on finding the answer. I think part of the thing is the focus, the hard focus on what you need to know to go on with your life. That is what I hope encourages people to look and find an answer for themselves. You don't have to write it, but it would be a good process. It's like a diary. It's like another way of sorting. But do not give up on getting your answer. You know, when I started my search, both of my parents were deceased. I couldn't go ask them. But there was another way. And maybe I don't have the absolute total picture, but I have a lot more than I did as a kid. And a kid always has their own world to penetrate as an adult and get past. So we're all adults here. We all have stories here. We all do. Don't hesitate to search and find your answers.
And similarly, I hope that readers take away a reminder that every story is particular and unique, because I think Americans will come into the book like having certain assumptions about what it means to be Greek. And because I'm not a typical case of somebody being raised either in Greece or Cyprus or even Greek America, my story subverts a lot of those or challenges a lot of those assumptions. And I hope the result of having those maybe stereotypes or challenge or assumptions challenged is to remember that every story is unique, and therefore the reader's own story is also going to be unique and worth telling.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm just going to put into the chat, I know this audience will want to continue to follow and stay up to speed on not only your current work, but your upcoming work. And I'm just curious, can you touch on what's coming up next? Do you have any projects on the horizon or aspirations?
Well, for myself, I am reverting back to mythology, Greek mythology, and taking some of those prototypes and archetypes from mythology and weaving them into new stories. I have a manuscript that deals with the story of Circe, the sorceress, the wonderful woman, as I make her out to be, and her adventures in exploring the island of Delos, relationships with Apollo, Pluto, Zeus, exploring a new relationship after Odysseus with a Glaucus, and living in a magical world. Oh, sorry about this. Phone's life goes on.
Is that Circe calling?
That is Circe, yay! So it's a new genre and it's an exciting project. I just love working on it.
And my second book, the idea started as a joke because I have the privilege of working for a university where there are grants for professors' research. And my first book just mostly dealt with memories. And as I mentioned before, most of the research was just reading up on the history and politics of Cyprus so that I can understand, which doesn't cost very much. And so I could never apply for a grant. And so I was like, okay, what would I want the university to pay me to do? And the answer was Nabausta Buzukia, which translates into to go Greek dancing. So, and that was a joke that I was saying, that my second book is I'm going to find a way to have my research require grants to send me Greek dancing. And then I started saying this joke over and over again. And I started thinking about the way people in Greece talk about what it means to have fun. The words like parea, words like gethi and meraki, which I already go over in my first book. And I thought about how in the US, and unfortunately this kind of neoliberal rhetoric is expanding throughout the world, but we have the self-care and wellness, which I think is almost like suggests that Americans are apologizing for having fun or relaxing. And I started noticing that more and more. And I was like, you know what, maybe it really is my second book. This is something I want to research. How do Greeks have fun? How do they talk about having fun? And when do they moralize about pleasure? And so I feel like there's a really complicated intersection of moralizing, morality, and how we relax. It's almost like Americans are sort of afraid to relax. So, and I am American, which is kind of actually one of the epiphanies that I had while writing the book. I fantasized so much about the importance of Greece and Cyprus that I kind of forgot that I'm actually American. So that was one of the things I had to face, like, oh, I'm American. So I am American. I am subject to the this cult of overwork and imagining relaxation as almost like in service of more work. So the question is, what do Greeks have to teach us about the value of community and joy and not working?
Well, that's beautiful. I definitely need to read that book. So I really have enjoyed the time here today. Does anyone have a final question you'd like to ask either of these authors? Well, again, if you aren't already following them, I've put their websites in the chat, and you know, these ladies are we need to follow them and see what they have going on, because they really are additive, and you've added so much to my life, both of you. Thank you so much, and we appreciate you being with us today. Have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christine and Sophia.
Yes, yes, yes. Have a good, lovely day or night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.